Well, it's good to have everybody here. Looking forward to our time together. Thanks for the apologetic folks from the apologetics and scholar community showing up and joining us today. Looking forward to our conversation with Fuzz about origins of life and how we can use that to engage the gospel. Many of you probably know who Fuzz is. Has a PhD on biochemistry. Has studied in Ohio, and he has been at Reasons to Believe for over 20 years now, haven't you, Fuzz?
Yes, 22 years.
22 years. And so just kind of, I know this was, if I remember correctly, this was the first book that you came out was about the origin of life. So I'm excited to hear just kind of what you have to think about that and how to engage that. Just as a reminder, what we're doing in these seminars and what RTB is about is how can we engage people with the gospel? And so we use apologetics not as an end in and of themselves, but as a tool that we can use to go out and equip Christians to engage others with the gospel and to engage others with the gospel ourselves. And so, just as we go through today, I want you to just kind of be mindful of that if you're not already, that, this isn't about getting the best argument. This isn't about how to win the debate, if you will. This is about how can we use these tools to engage people with the gospel. And so, Fuzz, before we jump in here, why don't you give us a brief description of why we use this testable creation model? Take a minute and just describe what is the testable creation model and why do we use that as our strategy?
Yeah, sure thing, Jeff. And I would, of course, invite you to jump in and offer your perspectives as well. As you point out, that our objective at Reasons to Believe is to use apologetics in service to evangelism. And, towards that end, we want to take seriously the exhortation of the Apostle Paul when he says that we should become all things to all people, that we might win a few. And it's not enough for many people in the scientific community or people that are scientifically minded, people that are influenced by the STEM disciplines, just simply to talk about evidence for God's existence or the reliability of Scripture. You really need to present it in a framework that invites them to engage. And for those that are scientists and, again, influenced by science, the most important thing is testability. And so what we have done at Reasons to Believe is we've couched our scientific apologetics in the framework of a creation model that makes predictions about what should be discovered if indeed we are correct. And this invites and allows people to evaluate our predictions in light of current scientific discoveries, allows us to demonstrate how current scientific discoveries affirm our predictions. And so it really invites people to engage in a framework that is familiar to those that are scientists and scientifically influenced.
I appreciate what you have to say. And, one of the things that I've really do appreciate and enjoy about Reasons to Believe is that idea of it's almost like you're inviting into a conversation. And the way scientists discuss things may be a little different, or, science-minded people are a little different. But there's just a lot of these ideas that Christianity is about. Tell me what, we're going to tell you what to believe instead of inviting people into thinking about what's true and how do we determine what's true and being willing to actually put your beliefs to the test, if you will. So kind of excited to see what we have today. I know we're talking about origin of life. And if I remember correctly, that is the first book that you published was Origin of Life. Is that not correct?
That is right. Yeah. Co-authored the book with Hugh Ross called Origins of Life. And in addition to that, I've also addressed the origin of life problem in another book called Creating Life in the Lab. And I touch on it tangentially in The Cell's Design. And I've got a book coming out in October called Fit for a Purpose, which also addresses issues related to the origin of life. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the origin of life problem, both scientifically as well as from a Christian worldview perspective.
So kind of if you could put this into the bigger picture, I know there's going to be details about, chemical evolution and all sorts of things that we're going to discuss as we go through. But what is the significance of the origin of life question to RTB's creation model?
Yeah, well, if you think about our creation model like a ladder, right? There are really two primary uprights to a ladder, and one of the uprights that makes up the RTB creation model ladder would be, of course, questions relating to the origin and the design of the universe. And then the other upright would be questions relating to the origin and the design of life. And when it comes to the origin of life problem specifically, that is equivalent to the questions relating to the origin of the universe. Where does the universe even come from? Well, where does life even come from? And so towards that end, the origin of life question is really foundational in many respects to our creation model. It's a major component of our creation model.
So that picture of a ladder, that's just kind of, I was not expecting you to go there, if I'm honest, but it's an interesting picture because you can take out rungs and a ladder still works. You take off the sides, not much goes on. Is that really that central to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so because, again, when you ask the question, where did we come from? Immediately, of course, that leads to the question, well, we are part of a universe. So where does that universe come from? And of course, we are living beings, and we note that life on Earth, or that Earth, is teeming with life. And so, it begs the question, where does that life come from? And where do we come from in light of the fact that there is a universe and there's a planet that's teeming with life? So, I really do think it is a central component to our creation model, because if indeed a creator is responsible for the world that we see in, and that human beings are ultimately the crown of creation, then, not only do we want to explain where the universe comes from, but where do we come from? And the first step in that explanation really is, where does life itself come from?
So, in terms of strategic importance, so my background's in astronomy, really physics, and I do physics with a telescope, if you will. But as I have done apologetics and thinking about what does physics bring to this game, when you look at the history of the last 100 years of history, there's just been this growing body of evidence that points to a universe that's expanding, a universe governed by constant laws of physics, a universe that has a beginning, a universe with decaying energy, or the usable energy that's decaying. That description of the universe is both biblical and scientific, and so there's this evidence pointing towards what the Bible has to say about the universe. How does the origin of life play into that? Because you can make an argument that the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about the origin of life.
Yeah, that's true, and and we can unpack, what our creation model specifically entails and how we get at the creation model for the origin of life in a second. But to me, the strategic importance of the origin of life question really is related to how many people in the scientific community, and in fact many people in our world today, view the question of biological origins. And it's strictly through a materialistic process, where many people argue that evolutionary mechanisms, whether it's chemical evolution or biological evolution, are ultimately responsible for the origin and the design and the history of life. And this would, of course, include the origin of humanity as well. But the point here is that these models are couched in strictly materialistic terms. They typically rely on mechanisms that, for all intents and purposes, appear to be unguided and undirected. And there's an anti-teleological perspective when it comes to the question of origins in the life sciences. And so I think it's necessary in the midst of that to be able to show people that when it comes to this grand claim of the paradigm that everything in biology could be explained through mechanism, that we're able to push back and say, but wait a minute, when it comes to the origin of life, which is arguably the most critical transition in life's history, that we don't have good scientific understanding from an evolutionary perspective how life could originate. And so this is essentially a concept that is a disruptor to a materialistic approach to the question of biological origins. And hopefully by introducing this disruptor into the equation, that it forces people to at least be open to the possibility that maybe at least the origin of life and the fundamental design of life may actually require a creator, even if you would allow for evolutionary mechanisms to explain the history and the diversity of life.
That's a fascinating point. If I get those kind of two things there, one is that there is this kind of overarching conversation in our society that the origin of life, the origin of humanity, those are best explained in terms of purely mechanistic ideas. It's like you have to get people to think outside of that, if you will. And in every talk I've got, there was an article that I read. It's where Pascal was talking on persuasion. And I want to get your comments on this because I think this is relevant to what you're saying. My summary of it is don't tell people they are wrong. Let them know that they may not have the whole picture, and then lead them to the answer, but let them discover it on their own. Sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about doing here, saying, wait a second, this may not be the whole picture. How can we go investigate this more deeply? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, it is. It is, absolutely. And in fact, the recognizing that the origin of life couldn't be explained, at least by what we understood at the time that I was a graduate student, couldn't be explained through evolutionary mechanisms was jarring to me. And that was the first step towards me recognizing that there must be a creator. And I know of so many people that have backgrounds in biology who basically will adopt the position, look, if evolution can explain everything in biology, then a creator is superfluous. A creator is unnecessary. And so those are the types of people, I think, that you can begin to engage with the origin of life problem. And again, recognizing that we currently don't have a good scientific explanation for the origin of life, regardless of the particular or specific model that origin of life researchers might posit.
So kind of flesh that out a little bit. What is the origin of life problem, if you will? And, I know that's going to immediately get into the God of the gaps. Anybody who's done a little bit of work with this knows that those two tend to go hand in hand in the way most secular people think about it.
Yeah, well, and if people want details, obviously they can look at Origins of Life or Creating Life in the Lab, where we methodically go through every model that origin of life researchers have proposed, at least at the time that the book was written, that I would consider to be, more prevalent in mainstream models, and show why those models won't work for chemical and physical reasons. And so, and in my experience, many Christian apologists are very quick to adopt that particular approach where we critique chemical evolutionary models. And again, I think that's necessary. You can't avoid doing that. But oftentimes that's where people stop. That's where they start and they stop when it comes to apologetics. And of course, if indeed, evolution can't explain the origin of life, it is logically possible at that point that maybe the explanation is a creator, but that leads you to kind of a God of the gaps, approach. And as I've engaged origin of life researchers, they know what the problems are. And so, I've had many origin of life researchers pick up our books and look at them and agree that our critique is actually sound, and that our critique is spot on. But yet they would argue that just because we currently don't know how life originates doesn't mean we may not figure that out someday in the future. And of course they're appealing to the history of science, where science ultimately solves, what appear to be in this day and age intractable problems in the future as new insights are gleaned. And there is progress that's made continually in origin of life research, where people look at these advances and they would again agree that this doesn't explain the origin of life, but these at least represent pieces of the puzzle, and these represent clues. And so when you present a critique of chemical evolution, again, that's well and good. It's an idea that's a disruptor, but for many people that are familiar with anything related to the origin of life, if you stop at that point, they will dismiss the argument as God of the gaps reasoning.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are two things to focus on as we're talking about this. One is, what is the origin of life problem, and that's the idea that we don't have a good explanation for the origin of life. But then there's the second part is, how do you provide an alternative? So instead of just oh, we don't know the explanation for the origin of life scientifically, therefore it must be God. That logic doesn't follow for most people. You got to do something to engage that. And so that's I'm going to ask you about what RTB's creation model and how it engages that. But it does seem like even in that what are the problems there? Depending on the scientific knowledge of the person you're talking to, what you engage is going to be different there. You mentioned that most people who have a lot of, most people you've engaged seem to already know the problems. How do you engage someone who doesn't know all the problems? What are some things that you can bring to light there kind of quickly?
Yeah, well, and this actually will lead to one approach that we can use to make a positive case that a creator must be necessary as we look at the origin of life problem. And one of the things that I find most lay people are very, very quick to grasp, and that is that in order to get different prebiotic reactions to work in the laboratory, so let's say if we're trying to explain where does the sugar ribose come from, which is a central component in RNA molecules, and it is a precursor to deoxyribose, which is the sugar that's found in DNA. Of course, as part of the origin of life, you have to explain, where that particular, component of DNA and RNA comes from. And so origin of life researchers have suggested something called the Formose reaction, and I won't get into the details of it other than to say that the Formose reaction works beautifully in a laboratory when you're working under chemically pristine conditions, where you've got organic chemists controlling the starting conditions, monitoring the reaction, where they're very careful to exclude contaminating materials that would disrupt the reaction. They stop the reaction before the products in turn become reactants, and you wind up with a tarry mess at the bottom of the reaction vessel. And so it's an interesting reaction that in principle could support chemical evolution, but it only works because you have essentially organic chemists superintending the process. And the question then becomes, well, what's going to happen on the conditions of the early Earth? You don't have chemically pristine conditions. You don't have organic chemists setting up the initial conditions and monitoring the reaction, making sure that everything is working ideally so that the reaction will proceed. Rather, the Earth's an uncontrolled environment where it's highly unlikely that the Formose reaction that works beautifully in the lab would ever operate under the conditions of the early Earth. And you can show this problem over and over and over again, when it comes to every aspect of prebiotic chemistry that's been explored. And so this problem is now recognized by origin of life researchers and is dubbed the problem of unwarranted researcher involvement, where they realize that the researchers have actually incorporated themselves into the very design of the experiment, and their involvement is central to the success of the experiment. And so they argue that that kind of work in the lab is really irrelevant to the origin of life problem because that kind of control would never exist on the early Earth. But what's provocative here is that you see in prebiotic chemistry, because of this problem of unwarranted researcher involvement, that intelligent agency seems to be playing a vital role in the success of that reaction. And so by analogy, you could argue, would you not then need an intelligent agent to superintend in some means what's happening on the early Earth to go from simple molecules to the very first cells? So this is a way where you can turn the problems that you identify in prebiotic chemistry towards a positive argument for a creator's role. And in fact, this is the theme of my book, Creating Life in the Lab, is that the work in prebiotic chemistry as well as work in synthetic biology, where scientists are trying to create artificial cells in the lab, time and time and time again demonstrate the central role intelligent agency plays. And so this is a way in which I think not only can we connect with lay people, because I think most lay people readily grasp that argument, and the conceptual aspects of that argument I think are reasonably accessible to even those that are not scientifically minded. But at the same time, this is actually a concern that is now raised by origin of life researchers themselves and is a concern that is actually appearing in journal articles that are published, addressing questions in prebiotic chemistry. So that's one way we can go from God of the gaps to making a positive case for a creator when it comes to the origin of life.
So, I find that your description is interesting in this regard, that I think you're identifying a problem that origin of life researchers face. They're just struggling to wrestle in there. Most origin of life researchers are saying, well, maybe it's this mechanism, maybe it's, trying to put together a model, if you will. RTB's creation model doesn't seem to be quite so much in that vein of here's all the mechanisms, but it's almost seems to be stepping back and saying, okay, let's take a look at the big picture. Where we find success in making these steps work requires external intervention. So it's arguing by analogy. Is that an actual model, or is that more of a tool to engage people to think about the bigger pictures that the science is raising?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not in and of itself a model, which, and that's a very good point you're raising, but it is a scientific, it's a scientific technique, if you will, that can be used to demonstrate the work of intelligent agency. And so, for example, when you look at the work of an archaeologist that picks up a rock and says, well, this rock was actually shaped by an intelligent agent, by a hominin, as opposed to the forces of nature. What they're doing is they're looking at these systems and they're saying, okay, there are three criteria they're using. One is, does it have the appearance of artificiality? Second is, can I explain these features through natural process mechanisms? And then thirdly, it's like, what would it take for me to go into a lab and to replicate these features? This is actually called experimental archaeology. And it's a combination of those three criteria that lead them to conclude an intelligent agent shaped this particular rock into a tool or something like that. So likewise, when it comes to the origin of life, we can point out that, everybody recognizes that biochemical systems and biological systems in general have the appearance of design. So the question is, how do we explain that design? Well, we can show that chemical evolution comes up short, at least as we currently understand it. So we've eliminated natural process explanations. And then if we can say, well, what does it take now to try to replicate the different steps in chemical evolution, or what does it take to create an artificial cell? Well, laboratory experiments tell us it takes intelligent agency to do this. And so this becomes a scientific criteria that is analogous to what you see in archaeology, that at least allows us to establish the work of intelligent agency. But it's using criteria that can essentially be engaged. We can argue, are these systems truly artificial in nature? Do they truly appear to be designed? We can discuss and do experimental work to evaluate, can natural process explanations do the work? The work in synthetic biology and prebiotic chemistry is empirical work, right? That where we're reaching an empirical conclusion. So it's not a model in and of itself, but it is a very important component of our model, which is to say that we can establish with some scientific rigor the role of intelligent agency in the origin and the design of life, using criteria that other scientific disciplines employ, like archaeologists, or in fact, the same set of criteria is used for by SETI researchers as well.
Yeah, that to me is a fascinating point, and I know that's beyond, or that whole idea of bringing external or intervention in, looking for design, looking for human agency, if you will, or non-natural processes. It does seem like that's something that RTB, by driving the conversation, by asking those questions, has at least prepared some people to be able to consider that. So, it seems like that just fits right in line with our creation model has that aspect of saying, okay, hey, wait a second, there are bigger problems, and these problems. Have we thought about looking at it this way, and then just inviting other tools that we already use in other disciplines? So you've mentioned that in prebiotic chemistry. Kind of how has that played out in synthetic biology?
Well, again, it's very similar, because in many respects, what people are doing in synthetic biology when they're trying to create artificial cells is in effect the same set of experiments that origin of life researchers are doing when they're trying to explain how chemical evolution could convert simple molecules into chemical supersystems that assume the properties of life. Synthetic biologists are trying to take molecular assemblies and manipulate them in such a way that they begin to assume the properties of cellular life. And again, the work that's done in synthetic biology is, in my view, science at its very best. And it's only possible because you have some of the most brilliant minds in the world that are working on the problem. But what I like about this approach is that instead of putting us at animosity with people working in origin of life research, what we can do is actually find many places that we can affirm the work that they're doing, where we can say that, look, in principle, you've identified successfully different chemical and physical processes that, at least in principle, could contribute to the origin of life. You've done a wonderful job of mechanistically figuring out how these processes work. What you have failed to do, and you yourself acknowledge this, is you failed to show geochemical relevance to the conditions of the early Earth. So we're all in agreement up to that point. Or with synthetic biologists, we can say what you have done is absolutely remarkable in terms of a scientific accomplishment. And the fact that you did this is a reflection of your brilliance as a researcher. But do you realize what the implications of that are? That if it takes you as a brilliant researcher to do this, how is this going to happen on its own in an unguided manner, apart from the role of an intelligent agent? So the place where we are forcing, the departure is actually when we're beginning to draw theological implications from the work in prebiotic chemistry and synthetic biology, where we are, in effect, saying that there are theological implications here. And in my experience, I find origin of life researchers, people that are working in synthetic biology, would agree with everything I say, and where they end up stopping short is saying we are unable to make that theological leap to, a creator being responsible. But now we've been successful in that we've really forced people to the precipice of recognizing that mechanism alone doesn't seem to be sufficient, and that at least it's not unreasonable to entertain an intelligent agency is responsible for the origin of life.
Well, I would say not only are we forcing them, we're also almost inviting them to come, hey, look deeper, if you will. One more question from me, and then I want to get to some of the questions that we have from our audience here. Just as I'm listening to your description, and I've dialogued with you about this now for the past 15 or better years, it really seems like there's a whole lot of things in origin of life research where scientists have made some remarkable advances in what might be the explanation for the origin of life. And I want to put it in this context, that if our goal was simply to show that naturalistic processes can't do this, it would be much easier if there were no really viable alternatives out there. And you've acknowledged that there are some things that might work, that actually that we actually have some understanding of how things might work. But it almost seems like to have a really sound apologetic argument, we actually need to have some understanding of them. For example, if we never found any planets outside our solar system, we wouldn't be able to evaluate how life-friendly ours was outside of just some philosophical arguments. By having planets, we can now actually put some data to how habitable our planet is. Seems like a very similar process is going along in origin of life. We're actually getting some knowledge about how it might work that allows us to actually put more meat onto the apologetic argument, if you will.
That's an excellent point, Jeff, an excellent analogy or an excellent point of connection. I don't think I actually have anything to add to that. That was such a well-made point.
Well, good. Okay. Well, then I guess that wasn't really a good question then, but let's go ahead and got a number of questions, and I'll just kind of start working them through here. Kirby Hansen asks, what do you think are the best scientific arguments in support of a naturalistic origin of life?
That's a great question. To me, I think, if there is a solution from an evolutionary perspective to the origin of life, it may actually be found in what's known as synthesis in the whole, or a Beilstein synthesis. And the idea behind this kind of reaction would be that you're throwing everything under the sun into a reaction vessel, and you're just letting it react. And nobody has really done this type of experiment up to this point in time, because we never really had the analytical chemistry power to actually analyze those kinds of systems, let alone begin to tease out, what the different chemical pathways might be, in that reaction vessel. But we now are beginning to have that analytical capability. We have computational power that allows us to, characterize those systems. Plus, we're able to do chemistry in silico, where we can run chemical reactions in a computer environment, if you will, and use that as a tool. And so more and more origin of life researchers are beginning to explore the idea of synthesis in the whole, where the argument would be maybe actually the solution to the origin of life is in the total complexity, chemical and physical complexity of the early Earth, where out of that complex environment, maybe the mechanisms that we need for the origin of life would actually emerge kind of as an emergent feature or an emergent property. Now, I'm not convinced that this approach is going to work, but this is an untested approach that many origin of life researchers are really very excited about. And when I was, along with Hugh, at the last Origin of Life conference at UC San Diego, maybe it was 2017, I think, when we were at that conference, that was a major emphasis at the conference that I saw, was people beginning to try to figure out how to do that, approach the problem as a synthesis in the whole problem. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But that, to me, would be probably the best prospect that origin of life researchers would have at this point in time, is that maybe out of the absolute complexity, you just might have an emergent reactions and processes that could produce, the origin of life.
So it does still kind of seem like there's this approach to science will solve this problem, rather than having, we've got a good mechanism at this point. You made a comment in there related to a question that Robert Gibson, so I'll throw this one at you. It says genes in prokaryotes can be analyzed using logic circuits, which electrical engineers like to design. How easy would this analogy be to explain to an average person in a talk on the origin of life?
Well, in a sense, Robert, that's a great question. And I think the point that you're bringing up, I don't know that I would necessarily say that it is formally part of an origin of life discussion, but it is a discussion that is relevant to the design of living systems. And so prokaryotic cells are rather simple cells, and the fact that you're seeing, with regard to their gene networks, what appear to be this type of circuitry that engineers would develop, really lends itself to a type of watchmaker argument, where you would be using maybe that insight to make the case that not only do biochemical systems have the appearance of design, but the similarity between these systems and the types of designs that we build as human beings is rather eerie. And that suggests that not only is there a mind responsible, but that there's some kind of connection between that divine mind and our mind as many creators. So that insight actually allows you to move from a generalized design argument to one that is more theistic in nature, involving Christian theism, where you're now being able to introduce the concept of the image of God. So that's how I would, approach that. So I don't know that I would bring that up in a discussion about the origin of life per se, but I would bring that up as a really wonderful piece of evidence for the fact that biochemical systems have this, compelling appearance of design. To me, I find that lay people find the watchmaker approach to be really accessible, because if you can bring up designs that lay people are likely to be familiar with, and then you show that biochemical systems display those same kind of features, I think people right away intuitively get the point that you're making. And it becomes a very powerful argument from analogy for design.
So Jimmy Slack asked a question, and I'm going to specifically ask this question in this context. His specific question is: have there been many important developments in origin of life research since the publication of your book, Origins of Life? And I know the answer is yes, because that's, you've written Cells Design, you've written Creating Life in the Lab, your new book that's coming out on biochemical design. But specifically in the context of what are those advances that help us engage people to think maybe they don't have all the answers, maybe there's something more to this that really does point to Christianity?
Yeah, well, and Jeff, thanks again for pointing out, the Cells Design and Creating Life in the Lab. But I also would say that I've got a blog called The Cells Design, where I write articles from time to time about some latest advances in origin of life research. And I know that Hugh Ross does as well. And I would be surprised if you haven't written articles dealing with the origin of life yourself. So, I would say our website is a great place to monitor, what we would consider to be some of the most significant advances. To me, I think, again, the biggest advance that I've seen up to this point is to begin to think about chemical evolution in terms of chemical complexity. So, traditionally, one of the big challenges with the RNA world hypothesis and the idea that the very first biochemistry was built around RNA is how do you actually form the building blocks of RNA, and then how do you get those building block materials to come together to form a nucleotide? That was considered to be an intractable problem. Well, about a decade ago, a chemist at University of Manchester in the UK intermingled chemical routes for the preparation of nucleobases with chemical routes for the preparation of sugars, and showed by intermingling those pathways, you could develop a 5-step reaction scheme that could actually produce nucleotides, could produce 2 of the 4 ribonucleotides. This was a huge conceptual breakthrough, and since that time, more and more people are doing those kinds of studies where they're beginning to intermingle different kinds of chemical and physical processes and are seeing some very interesting results along those lines. But this again leads us to the point that we were making earlier. Even when you evaluate this work, you still see the problem of unwarranted researcher involvement in these studies, where the success of the work is ultimately due to the fact that you have intelligent agents or highly skilled and knowledgeable organic chemists that are using their knowledge of organic reactions to manipulate the laboratory conditions to ensure the success of those reactions. And it's unlikely that those processes could ever, again, work on the conditions of the early Earth. But this is kind of a fun type of an advance because, again, we can say this is an incredible breakthrough that you've made. This is an interesting experiment, and we can celebrate their success and at the same time, again, highlight the fact that, with the question, is this really geochemically relevant? And, if what role is a researcher playing in the success of this work? And does that invalidate the conclusions you draw? And what does this mean for the origin of life problem? Is this suggestive of the work of an intelligent agent? So, again, there's some interesting things happening in origin of life research, but it's time and time again exposing the same problem of unwarranted researcher involvement in one way, shape, form, or the other.
So I'm going to take a little bit, or you got a question here from George and by Mark Rice, both asking. I'll read the questions and then summarize how I would like you to answer the question. It says, 2019 study of nonlinear meteorites by astronomers led Stephen Moises to indicate that the heavy bombardment of Earth ended by 4.5 billion years ago. Has RTB incorporated this evidence into our model? And then there's another discovery that George Haraxin points out about animals emerged 350 million years earlier than previously thought, as a fossil discovery suggests. And so these ideas of the Cambrian explosion playing and when animals came about, the late heavy bombardment, about what's going on the early Earth, seem to play pretty heavily in RTB's creation model. What do you do when studies come up that seem to refute those or significantly change how we look at them? Aren't we just building a model that then once these discoveries come out is no longer useful, or we were just wrong, if you will?
Yeah, and one of the things that we, I think, neglected to do, Jeff, and I own the responsibility for this, is to essentially lay out our creation model for the origin of life. And of course, central to that model is that there's a creator that is responsible for intervening to bring about the origin of the very first life forms. And so what we've talked up to this point is really making a scientific case for a creator. But what we want to do with our apologetic approach is to go one step further and make the case that the creation accounts found in Scripture are reliable as well. That's a very important part of our apologetic. And so we argue that the passage in Genesis 1 that seems to have the most bearing on the origin of life would be Genesis 1:2, and perhaps the first day of creation, where in Genesis 1:2 we see the earth described as a water world where there's darkness everywhere, and that in the original Hebrew the implication is that the earth is a harsh, hostile environment, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And by comparing the Hebrew language there with what we see in Deuteronomy 32 and the Song of Moses, we would argue that this may well be making a reference or an inference to the creation of the very first cells. And I'm not going to get into the specifics defending that. But essentially, our model would then predict that life would appear very early in Earth's history under hostile conditions, and that what we see in Genesis 1:2 would be an accurate depiction of the early Earth in its primordial state. And we would also, of course, make other predictions that don't flow out of Scripture, but again, that life's chemistry would appear to be designed, that there's an intrinsic or an inherent complexity to life itself. The very first life forms would be complex. And so the bulk of the evidence that I've seen over the last 22 years is that those predictions of our model, hold up, that life does appear to be designed, that the very first life on Earth appears very early, easily 3.8 billion years ago, maybe even earlier than that, maybe even 4.1, 4.2 billion years ago. And that life seems to appear under harsh, hostile conditions on the early Earth, and that the very first cells are simple morphologically speaking, but are metabolically speaking incredibly complex organisms. So the key tenets of our model have been, I think, well established scientifically and continue to be affirmed. Now, the exact time frame of the late heavy bombardment is up for scientific debate. The extent of the late heavy bombardment is, in terms of the damage that it incurred on the early Earth, is again up for debate. Some people think it would have been a sterilization event for only life on the surface. Others think it would have sterilized life on the surface and the subsurface, that it would have been a complete sterilization event. Others, again, think that life could have easily endured the late heavy bombardment through a variety of mechanisms. And so, that particular aspect of our creation model is in dispute, but the broad features are strongly affirmed, that life appears early in Earth's history, that the very first life forms are complex, that life appeared on a primordial planet that's very similar to what we see described in Genesis 1:2, and that life emerges under harsh, hostile conditions. These are, I think, all well-established facts scientifically speaking. But this is the beauty of the creation model, is that we would expect that over time some of our predictions are actually going to be falsified. We would also predict that some of our predictions, or expect, some of our predictions will be affirmed and continue to be affirmed. But even those places where our predictions are falsified, it's going to force us to go back and revise the model. And in my experience, when we've had to do that, what we wind up with is actually a more robust model. And so this is part of the appeal, I think, of the creation model approach for scientifically minded people, is the fact that we can be wrong makes it worth it to some people to engage our ideas and to engage us. And if we're willing to acknowledge where, again, our predictions fail, or where predictions are maybe, in an unsettled state, that actually elevates our credibility and makes people even more willing to engage us and to want to hear, what we have to say. So, to me, I think many times as apologists, we're so concerned about being right that we fail to essentially use those opportunities when maybe we didn't get things right to actually advance the conversation and to further the engagement.
Well, and I love what you're describing in there, because, we can talk about the late heavy bombardment, the timing of the Cambrian explosion. And at the end of the day, the Bible really doesn't say a whole lot about this. I mean, if I'm honest, when I first heard about the late heavy bombardment, the fact that life shows up 700 million years after Earth was formed, that seemed odd to me, because it seems like it's describing the early Earth, if you will. And so, say that Moises is right and you push the date back to 4.8 billion or 4.5 billion. Well, that's just pushing it back closer to the beginning of the Earth. And yet it's still, as you said, the Bible describes a hostile to life environment, which is dark and covered in water. That description still fits, whether we're talking 4.5 billion years ago or 3.8 billion years ago. And so knowing what the Bible has to say is what takes that out of a nice teleological argument, if you will, and into a, hey, this is what the Bible's had to say about this. And so it requires us to know our Bible well. So I'm going to tie that into Mary Bean asked a question: how do we use this origin of life with lay people for the purpose of evangelism?
Yeah, Mary, that's a great question, and if I'm engaging a lay person, I will go right away to the Miller-Urey experiment, because people may not know what the Miller-Urey experiment is by name, but they have all encountered it in their biology class, which is, of course, the experiment done by Stanley Miller, where he made amino acids in the 1950s. Under simulated early Earth conditions. And, what's nice about that is that, again, people are familiar with that. And I meet a lot of people who are not scientists who say that experiment, when they read about that in high school, convinced them that evolution was true, that life didn't require a creator, both non-believers and believers alike. I hear that from both perspectives. And yet this is an interesting experiment that is historically relevant to the origin of life, because it inaugurated origin of life research as a formal scientific program. But in fact, most people don't think the Miller-Urey experiment is relevant today, because the conditions that Miller used in his experiment are not what we now know the conditions of the early Earth to be. And if you use those conditions, you get nothing in the Miller-Urey reaction, nothing forms. So this is a wonderful way of showing people that, hey, what you thought about the origin of life, the perception you have from your high school or college biology class, actually isn't necessarily correct. And again, you can show that the problem with the Miller-Urey experiment ultimately is unwarranted researcher involvement. Where not only did he get the conditions wrong, but when you look at the setup, again, it's a highly artificial, contrived setup that is designed to produce amino acids. And so, that would be how I would approach it with a layperson, is try to find something that they would be familiar with and use that as a starting point, as a bridge point.
So kind of shift gears a little bit here. Dave Newquist asked this question: do you have comments on the recent pair of articles in the PSCF by Jim Stump and others that say that the origin of life is a gradual process, not a sudden jump, and seem favorable to naturalistic ideas? They locate God's design in the characteristics of chemistry. And I know that's related to what you've talked about in your latest book, so I want to give you a little chance to discuss that, and then I have a follow-up question once you give me an answer.
Yeah, well, again, this is relevant to the question that was asked earlier about when did the late heavy bombardment appear? Because did life appear on Earth suddenly in a relatively short window of time, or did it appear over a protracted period of time, hundreds of millions of years, pushing a billion years? So the timing of the late heavy bombardment bears significantly on that question. But our argument is much more than the fact that life appears suddenly on Earth. And this is where, again, we would go back to the idea of unwarranted researcher involvement, in prebiotic chemistry. Regardless of when the late heavy bombardment happens, the idea of unwarranted researcher involvement looms large, whether you've got 10 million years or a billion years for the origin of life to transpire. Time is not going to get you out of the fact that you've got to have intelligent agency jimmy rigging the system to contribute to the different steps that would be needed for chemical evolution. So I would disagree with Jim Stump on that point. I haven't read those articles. Now, in my book, Fit for a Purpose, it's a book about applying the anthropic principle to biochemical systems, where I argue that you see a type of biochemical fine-tuning that would be comparable to the fine-tuning you see in the universe. And I'm not going to get into specifics here. We don't have the time. But that book will be available, God willing, and the creek don't rise in October. But as part of that book, I begin to touch on the possibility that there may actually be anthropic coincidences when it comes to prebiotic chemistry. In other words, that if you go down the path of chemical evolution, you very well may be forced to a theistic conclusion regardless, because it very well may be that the laws of nature have rigged chemistry in such a way that what is produced through prebiotic reactions are the types of building block materials that you would precisely need for life to be possible, and that if chemistry was any different, you would wind up producing materials that would be completely useless for prebiotic reactions. So there very well could be anthropic coincidences that you would actually see in prebiotic chemistry itself. And in fact, I've written a blog article that will be published hopefully in the near future for the Cell's Design, where I talk about anthropic coincidences and the origin of what's known as the Krebs cycle. So I am somewhat sympathetic to the point that Jim Stump is making here, that is that even if you go down the path of chemical evolution, you very well may be forced into theistic conclusions where it looks like chemical evolution may have been jimmy-rigged from the get-go to actually lead inexorably to the origin of life itself. That's a very provocative idea. I don't think it's been established, but I think there are some very interesting insights coming from prebiotic chemistry that are beginning to raise that as a very interesting prospect. And so that is an idea that I think as old Earth creationists we could easily appropriate. It's not an idea that's limited to evolutionary creationists. In fact, that idea may actually serve as a bridge between evolutionary creation and old Earth creation.
So I had this question posed, and this is related to this very question, and you kind of hit on it already. So say God comes back or takes back, says, all right, here's the origin of life. Here's what it looks like. What do you think you would actually see? And let me clarify it for not so much, I would expect to see this. Would you expect to see things that were beyond our explanation? Would you expect to see things gradual progression, easily to explain? I mean, kind of not so much the physical processes, but what are the nature of the processes involved?
Yeah, the ideas, to address that question, the ideas of our friends Hugh Henry and Dan Dyke, who are past visiting scholars, members of the scholar community, the ideas of Hugh Henry and Dan Dyke have really influenced my thinking along these lines. And they've developed this concept called hypernaturalism. And if people want to search our website, they can find some articles that Dan Dyke and Hugh Henry have written about hypernaturalism. But in a nutshell, they contrast hypernaturalism with supernaturalism, where supernaturalism is God is operating exclusively outside the laws of nature to bring about creative purposes. Whereas hypernaturalism is that God is operating within the laws of nature to bring about creative purposes, but that he is operating in a miraculous way nevertheless, because he is intervening in such a way that the just right event happens at the just right time with the just right magnitude. And that it's just as much a miracle as God intervening outside the laws of nature. And their point is that if God created the world that we live in, including the laws of nature, then as he continues to function as a creator, why would he then violate the very laws of nature that he imposed upon the created order? Would he not work within those laws itself? And so what I realized is that that the ideas of Hugh Henry and Dan Dyke intersect with this idea of that we've been talking about of unwarranted researcher involvement and the arguments that I made in the book Creating Life in the Lab, where we basically have argued that there's nothing fundamentally in the laws of chemistry and physics that essentially counter chemical evolution. In other words, the chemistry and physics we need for chemical evolution to work exists. It's part of the nature of the universe itself. The question is that these laws of nature cannot operate under the conditions of the early Earth in an uncontrolled manner and produce the very first life forms, but in a laboratory they can, where you now have the researcher playing a role, intervening as an intelligent agent to bring about the desired endpoint. In other words, that researcher is functioning hypernaturally, right? He or she is using the laws of nature and manipulating them so that the laws of nature are functioning in the just right way at the just right time with the just right magnitude to successfully affect the outcome of a prebiotic reaction. And so could it be that God is operating hypernaturally to bring about the origin of life? That in other words, we wouldn't see anything that would shock us as being supernatural when we saw if we could observe the origin of life, but rather what we would see is that chemistry and physics giving rise to the very first cells, but we would recognize that this was miraculous because the just right chemistry was happening at the just right time under the just right conditions in order to affect different stages in chemical evolution. And this process could happen rapidly or it could happen over a protracted period of time, and in both instances be just as miraculous. So to me, I'm very much enamored with this idea of hypernaturalism, where it allows you, again, to pose a design or a creation model explanation for the origin of life, but you do it in such a way that it now still remains a scientifically investigatable problem. So you're building bridges with somebody who is a materialist, or who at least is deeply committed to methodological naturalism as the approach to do science.
I not that it surprises me much, but your answer mirrors mine quite a bit. It was just kind of thought that we'd look there and say, "Oh, that's it. I could all," but I didn't. Apart from intervention, that would have never all happened together. So I appreciate hearing your answer there. I got two more questions here. One's a comment by Bob DiSilvestro, and then I have a question by Pat McGuire, and I think we'll wrap up with that. It says our discussion, at least to the time, had seemed mostly about making molecules. His comment was, this has difficulties, but an even bigger issue is to assemble molecules to create information, and not just information, but coordinated information. Any thoughts or comments on how to use that to engage people in gospel conversations?
Yeah, and just as a point of full disclosure, I am increasingly becoming reluctant to use the information argument that many Christian apologists use, where we calculate probabilities of generating information-rich molecules. I think, and I'm not going to get into, I don't have time to get into the details as to why I'm increasingly uncomfortable with those arguments. But I do believe that the quality of information, the fact that biochemical systems are information systems, to me is really provocative and is a very powerful piece of evidence, I think, in favor of a role of a creator in the origin and design of life. And to me, a couple of points I want to make is one, is that what's remarkable to me is that information is actually in the form of information that we would generate and create as human beings. In other words, the information technologies that we have developed as human beings are represented in biochemical systems. And that, to me, allows for a very interesting watchmaker argument to be made. But on top of that, to me, I think what many Christian apologists do is focus on what Paul Davies calls simple information, which is the information content in the sequence of proteins or nucleic acids. And his point is that really what we ought to be thinking about is the algorithmic nature of the cell's information. What we see in the cell is information in the form of instructions that are instantiated in the very matter of life itself. And this algorithmic information is essentially dictating the matter in the cells. It is dictating the behavior and the operation, is regulating the matter that constitutes life. And in fact, Davies and Sarah Walker argue that the analogy for the cell would be a von Neumann universal constructor, which would be a machine that contains the information needed to make other machines, including replicating itself. And the idea here is that to make a von Neumann universal constructor work, it requires algorithmic information that's embedded in the very makeup or operation of the machine itself. And so to me, I think this is the way to go if we're going to make the information argument, is through the use of algorithmic information following Paul Davies' lead, because his point is nobody knows how algorithmic information can originate. We've got models for how simple information can originate. And what I see is most Christian apologists focusing on the generation of simple information and essentially neglecting the algorithmic information argument, which is the argument that I would actually make. And I just today finished reading a journal article written by two biophysicists from UC San Francisco, and they were essentially arguing that there are these finite state machines, which are these computational machines that are essentially undergirding perhaps many biochemical operations. And so, in other words, they argue that there is information in these finite state machines that are found inside the cell, that are made up of biomolecules that are actually regulating the activity of cells, giving the appearance that cells have a brain or a nervous system, that cells carry out operations that make it look as if there's an intelligence that's undergirding the operation of those cells. And they argue that intelligence is actually in the form of information that is structured within these finite state machines. And so this is really provocative, again, in light of the idea of this algorithmic information argument, is that it could very well be that built into the molecules, again, of life are these computational capacities that reflect information and ultimately algorithmic information. So that would be the direction I would go with the information argument. And so the origin of life, according to Paul Davies, and I would agree with him, is how do you explain the origin of information? But it's not Shannon information or semantic information. It's actually algorithmic information that is really the fundamental question. Where does that information come from?
So thanks, Fuzz. We got to wrap up. I got a one-minute question for you from Pat McGuire. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to 3 or 4 other questions by Princeton, Juan Cadu, and Barry Wynn, Robert Gibson, and Bob Del Silvestro had a follow-up. But Pat McGuire's question was related to, I presume, with the discovery of methane from Enceladus, I believe it was. What are some of the original issues related to these discoveries, and particularly how can we use them to engage gospel conversations? Not so much here's how we explain this particular piece of information.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not completely sure I track that question, but I mean,
Okay,
obviously methane.
let me throw it at you again. So we're finding evidence of methane that may be biological origin on these moons. You got these moons that are covered in ice and water. How does that weigh into origin of life issues in ways that we can engage people to think, hey, they may not have the whole picture here?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. I got it. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, most people are under the impression that methane is a biomarker because there are methanogens that produce methane, and methane has a relatively short half-life in the atmosphere. It's photolytically unstable, and so the fact that we're seeing methane on these different bodies in our solar system suggests to some people that they are the product of biological activity. But we could come along and say, well, we would make a prediction that that this methane is actually produced through abiotic means, and so now we have two sets of predictions that we can then use as a point of engagement, a point of conversation, and people have identified some abiotic geological mechanisms that can generate methane. But this is a wonderful illustration of how instead of challenging, we can ask questions and invite people into a conversation where we ask questions. How would we demonstrate I'm correct? How would we demonstrate your ideas are correct? And that leads to engagement as opposed to conflict. And I think ultimately, as our friend Krista Bontrager has said many times, our objective when we are engaging people should be to make sure that we have opportunities to continue to engage them in the future, because it's out of that engagement that people are going to see Christ within us and are going to have a greater chance of ultimately hearing the gospel. If you engage people in a way that terminates the interaction, you're never going to have that chance to build a relationship that could be so critical for to sharing your faith with them in a meaningful way.
Well, thanks, Fuzz. I really appreciate your comments. Want to thank all the members of the apologetics and scholar communities for joining us today. I really do pray and hope that this has equipped you, helped you understand the creation model better, how origin of life plays into that conversation, but more importantly, that it equips you to be confident in the truth of Christianity and be able to go out and share that with those God brings across your path. Thanks for joining us today. Wish you well, and just God bless in all you do.